Sorry. Do you want to say it again?
Well, I will do. The Zoom people didn't hear me. Okay, this is really for the people who are tuning in on Zoom to say, please sign up to Košice. It's the most marvellous place, and Jana and Zoe have just been there, and the buildings, the churches, everything is to die for, including the lecture hall, which looks absolutely out of this world. And we'll be sending round an email with some pictures so people will feel more tempted. So just sign up and send me the money. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So tonight's lecture is one I've been looking forward to for a very long time. Meg's been on the cards for a couple of programs, and really glad to have got you into this slot. And I know lots of people here and at home will be looking forward to it too. Meg Bernstein will obviously be very well known to all of you, having been a member of the BAA for a long time and been to many conferences, and is a real stalwart of the BAA. She completed her PhD in art history at UCLA in 2019 under Meredith Cohen, and it was on English parish church architecture, really in the period before 1300, which isn't a period that's focused on as much as obviously the 15th century and the early 16th century. So, and that's going to be the focus of her lecture tonight. Currently, Meg is the Fulbright US Scholar in History of Art at the University of York, teaching in the History of Art department there, but also holding a postdoctoral fellowship from the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art. She's also held fellowships at the Courtauld and at Yale, and previously taught there, and at Columbia, Rhode Island School of Design and Kenyon College. So comes with obviously a huge amount of experience. One other thing that I have to flag is a recent publication of Meg's that's part of the Courtauld Books Online series, and this is called Towards an Art History of the English Parish Church, 1200 to 1399. I don't know, some of you might have been at that conference. I presented and then sadly didn't follow through with the publication. But it was a remarkable conference, actually, because the auditorium was absolutely full of people, and it was a really exciting conference and really pointed in a new direction for thinking about the parish church, both as a category, as a genre, but also as something that really needs study. And there's other publications, of course, that have appeared with the Society of Architectural Historians and the conference transactions of the BAA, and then forthcoming in studies in iconography. Before I hand over to Meg, I just wanted to say publicly on behalf of the BAA a great thank you to Meg, who really, without her, we wouldn't have had the quality of the digital lectures that we'd had from the beginning of the pandemic. Meg really took hold of that and kind of held our hands through it. She's the honorary web officer of the BAA, but that title doesn't really do service to what she's done for the BAA in the last couple of years. So thank you very much, Meg. Who's going to talk to us tonight on building and rebuilding the parish church 1150 to 1300.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. It's a real pleasure to be here with the BAA, and hello to people who might be watching from elsewhere. Estimated somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 examples, parish churches containing at least some medieval building fabric are ubiquitous in the English landscape. On my train down from York today, I could spot dozens of parish churches. Grantham with its tall western tower and pointy spire piercing the sky, and Woodwalton lying a mere 200 meters from the East Coast main line, just to name a few. Although constantly present, these churches have received far less attention, by and large and as a group, than other medieval building types, both ecclesiastical and secular. In the introduction to his 1983 report, The Church in British Archaeology, Richard Morris wrote about the paradox of the current state of the study of churches that remains an apt summary even today. He writes, "Whereas today we are better technically equipped than ever before to take advantage of opportunities for investigation, we have lost something of the sense of urgent curiosity, which lay behind and indeed provided a moral justification for the practice of church archaeology by antiquaries in the 19th century." And rather perceptively, he added to that, "Most insidious of all is the belief that almost everything worth knowing about churches is already known. when in fact past study has usually concentrated on the visible and most easily accessible parts of the standing fabric, with the result that the questions of origin have been ignored, the development of churches in their earlier phases oversimplified, and liturgical history neglected. But as Lloyd has pointed out, in the past 10 years, the study of parish churches has experienced a resurgence of interest. The Norwich Parish Churches Project and the Corpus of Scottish Medieval Parish Churches have both provided regional studies accomplished through collaborative projects. And both in 2017, the Harlexton Conference considered the urban church, while James Alexander Cameron and I organized the conference at the Courtauld that Lloyd mentioned. And the transactions for that conference have recently been published. But beyond that, numerous books have been published on parish churches in the past few years as well, many by members of the BAA, and many of these have focused on this later period that Lloyd was describing, more on the 14th, the 15th, and 16th centuries, rather than the High Middle Ages, benefiting from the increased frequency of documentation from that period. Yet, thousands of parish churches survive from the 12th and 13th centuries, prior to the establishment of the office of church warden or the common appearance of building contracts. So what I want to consider today is what we do know, and perhaps what we can know, about these buildings and rebuilding projects. In the following discussion, I focus particularly on the nave and the subsequent lateral expansions undertaken within the period. But first, I could probably fill the next hour with the difficult task of defining what exactly constitutes the parish church. Does the classification include the major churches of Hull and Hythe, even though those were officially dependent chapels of Hesel and Saltwood respectively? What about churches with collegiate functions, or aisles of cathedrals that were used as meeting places for a parish? And on this question, I would refer to a wonderful essay by Julian Luxford in the Parish Church Conference volume, and I'll leave it at that. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I follow Tom Nixon in his adoption of Richard Pfaff's definition, which is, a parish church is one that serves a community defined more by a locality, e.g. the parish church of Burford, than adherence to a rule like, say, Tewkesbury Abbey, or a set of statutes, Salisbury Cathedral. So this definition largely defines parish churches by what they are not, i.e. not the great church, the great abbey or cathedral. And to my mind, that I think is sufficient for the discussion I want to have today. The division of responsibility for the nave versus the chancel between parishioners and clergy is well known and best elucidated by Carol Crago in her 2010 Journal of Medieval History article, where she argues that it was a pragmatic solution desired by the people and sometimes opposed by the clergy, rather than a liability-limiting move on the part of the clergy that burdened parish communities. The earliest written codification of this principle appears in Bishop Peter de Roche's 1224 statutes that put forward pastoral legislation from Lateran IV and other sources. These state that the rector should attend to the physical fabric of the chancel and the parishioners should take care of the nave. Because this document first formalizes the division itself is usually dated back to 1224, but I maintain that this custom likely originated in the 12th century, as it did in parts of continental Europe, alongside the shift to the parochial mode of pastoral care. And I think the primary evidence for this assertion in England lies in the buildings themselves. For example, these large aisled naves of places like Waplot and Ripple. The naves of parish churches began to morph and change in ways that responded to the needs of the laity, rather than the doctrinal concerns or whims of wealthy patrons or the clergy. At Crick in Derbyshire, parishioners having responsibility of the nave is confirmed by an exception. In 1280, the parishioners petitioned to Archbishop Peckham that Crick Abbey, the largest landowner in the parish, should be responsible for repairing the nave. The Archbishop decided in favor of the parish by requiring the abbey to be proportionally responsible for nave liability in terms of the property that they owned in the parish. And in 1296 in Reculver, the right to the contents of a certain box for donations became a matter of dispute taken to Archbishop Winchelsea. The box was located between the nave and chancel, identified by its location near a great stone cross, probably a pre-conquest high cross. This specific location was of critical importance because it would literally mean that the contents of the box thus belong to either the parish to be used on the fabric of the church, or the clergy to be applied to the high altar. So a system involving multiple keys held by parishioners, clergy, and a representative from another village was devised, but ultimately the archbishop decided that the box and its funds were in the space of the laity, i.e. the nave. Documents that refer specifically to buildings and building processes before the 15th century are sparse, yet the abundance of surviving church fabric from this period testifies to the tremendous amount of building undertaken in England. Before the conquest in 1066, or between the conquest in 1066 and the death of Edward I in 1307, written records became more common. And although the Norman administration, and in particular its compilation of Domesday Book, ushered in increased documentary practices, in the 13th century these were still in their nascence. Thus, this lacuna of written sources can primarily be attributed to the fact that writing and preserving documents in the 12th and 13th centuries was far less common practice than in successive centuries. But before turning to the standing evidence gleaned from surviving buildings, I want to mind two documents from the late 13th century. One, a dispute about building works at Winchcombe, and another, a chantry certificate from Sleaford. Those records that do survive, in terms of records that do survive, they tend to reflect disputes rather than simply existing for purposes of recording or as a matter of course. And that's almost certainly the case for the first example, which was included in Saltzman's Buildings in England down to 1540. In 1245, Abbot Henry of Winchcombe Abbey wrote to Henry III with a request, which is that the king deny permission to the vicar, Henry of Camden, to lengthen the chancel and expand the south aisle of the adjacent parish church, St. Peter's. The church already had a north aisle that was built around 1175, and within it there was an altar dedicated to St. Nicholas that was dedicated after another church with the same designation or dedication elsewhere in town had burned down. So normally, I think, a building project such as the one at Winchcombe would have gone undocumented in the 13th century. But it was due to the possible injury to the abbey that the disturbance was recorded. The fact that St. Peter Winchcombe was in such close proximity to a major abbey is what caused this incident to be documented at all. And in fact, this wasn't the first time that Abbot Henry engaged in an adversarial conflict with the vicar. In 1231, the bells of the parish were rung so loudly and violently that they disturbed the monks during the canonical hours. And for the sum of his infractions, Abbot Henry went so far as to complain to the Pope, who in turn appointed a committee of clerics to the region to settle the dispute, which seems a little bit intense to me. The following year, permission from the Crown was granted to extend the parish church so long as the road to the abbey remained at least 30 feet wide and the highway at least 18 feet wide. So this result made an expansion possible, but likely not to the planned extent. But unfortunately, due to a total rebuilding of the parish church in the middle of the 15th century, the work that was carried out in response to the Crown's judgment is sadly lost to us. But the case at Winchcombe is interesting not only because it reflects one of the very few documents of building work in this period, but also because it shows that the vicar, not members of the parish, took responsibility for expanding the south aisle, seemingly at the same time as extending the chancel. And we would expect in this period that these would be two separate projects, the first at the expense of the parishioners and the second at the expense of the clergy. With regards to lay agency within the making of space within the parish church, there's a lucky survival in this chantry certificate from 1271 at Sleaford in Lincolnshire, which attests to the addition of an aisle to the church as a chantry donation. So merchants Thomas Blount and John de Breckham built a north aisle under the Church of St. Denis and endowed it with local land in exchange for the maintenance of perpetual service of the chapel and altar. This is a bit of a refrain, but unfortunately that church too was rebuilt later in the 14th century, and the aisle that is discussed in the document is lost. But we can see the provisions from the text. The commission involved supporting a chaplain and one assistant, and providing the books, vestments, liturgical vessels, and lighting, as well as building the space. The donors specified that the canonical hours should be kept, as well as Mass said, and that their names should be mentioned in the Mass. Furthermore, in addition to the activities which would take place in the north aisle, they noted that the chaplain should assist the parish priest with his duties when he was not otherwise occupied with their requirements. So not only was an entire aisle of the church built at his request, but Blount and de Breckham also furnished it at their expense and hired a priest to say mass there, specifying that their names presumably be said, sometimes presumably with others in the community in attendance. And this was set up prior to their death. And they say at the end of their request that they would continue providing for the material needs for the chapel throughout the rest of their days. Excuse me. That they would continue providing for the chapel through the rest of their days, after which time men of Sleaford entrusted with this responsibility would take care of this. And so there are contingency plans in place if their executors fail to complete the duties. So admittedly, this probably isn't actually all that unusual of a chantry certificate, but it is unusual to find prior to the 14th century. This document notes that they've already built their aisle, so it was constructed during their lifetimes. And as is common, there's virtually nothing that can be gleaned from the document above about what the space looked like. So attention is given to how it should be serviced, to what gear would be supplied for it, the same sorts of things that are often able to be gleaned from parochial visitations. But we don't really know from this what the aisle might have looked like and what concerns that these people might have had for it. So that's the nave as it stands today. The present west door and tower would have been the ones that Blount and de Breckham would have used during their lifetimes, dating to the end of the 12th century. But what do we know about the church that was appended to it? Their choice to build a north aisle to house their chantry suggests that the church was previously unaisled, or perhaps that it had only a south aisle. Within the parish community, their contemporaries and succeeding generations would have certainly been aware of their chantry, and indeed would have been invited to hear mass there. And the public nature of this donation would have been desirable for the two merchants. They would have celebrated this foundation during their lifetime and after their deaths. Not only would they have procured the prayers and pious thoughts of many members of the community, but they also would have solidified their social and economic standing within the community. The nave chantry chapel would act as a locus of community power and memory. Interestingly, and somewhat disappointingly, the certificate makes no mention of where the two merchants wished to be buried. I would guess they would have wanted to be buried in the chapel, but there's no mention made of that. So while mining these various documents gives us some insight into the impetus to build, the funding of projects, and to a lesser extent their use, what they don't tell us is how they were to look or who decided that. So I'll move now to considering what can be learned from the standing fabric of surviving parish churches. The cases of Winchcombe and Sleaford are both concerned with aisles, their addition and their expansion. This reflects a prevailing concern within the architecture of the 12th and 13th century parish church, which in turn has impacts on the shape of local parish churches for the rest of the Middle Ages and beyond. In the wake of the conquest, most Romanesque great churches were built with an aisled nave, but prior to and in the decades after the conquest, it's very rare for a local church to have aisles, and the exceptions to that can be fairly comprehensively described. Wing in Buckinghamshire has thick arcade piers, which may or may not date to before the conquest. Great Paxton was thought to be built in the decade prior to 1066, and has arcade piers leading to aisles. Walkern, St. Michael's at St. Albans, and Ickleton all have also been suggested as having 11th century aisles. But these churches were likely minsters, having some sort of higher status than the run-of-the-mill church. And following the conquest, many Romanesque parish churches were built without aisles and were never laterally expanded to include them. And these include, kind of famous examples like Addle, Stukely, and Iffley. So, although not all Romanesque parish churches had aisles built on, their addition becomes conventional in the later Romanesque period, as at Walsoken, dating around 1170, which has arcades with alternating circular and octagonal piers, supporting round arches topped with chevron and scalloped capitals. Long Sutton, in nearby Lincolnshire, shares similar Romanesque arcades. These and other churches in the Fenland region were built with what I'm calling grown-on aisles, rather than aisles added to extant buildings. And this distinction has to do with their moment of manufacture. While many churches throughout the country were already extant by the third quarter of the 12th century and were undergoing adaptation rather than being new builds, land in this region was being reclaimed due to salt production, and therefore, they provide interesting data about how a large parish church being created sort of ex nihilo was imagined by its patrons and its builders. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the addition of aisles to parish church naves proliferated, and the pervasiveness of aisles in this time is strong enough to have attracted attention from scholars from quite an early date. So Bond writes in 1905, the church with an aisled nave is the type par excellence of the English parish church. There are thousands of churches, both great and small, so planned. His account treats the addition of aisles as a sort of inevitability of the parish church building type. And I think that this sense of inevitability needs to be further examined. So I want to look at two examples of churches that were originally unaisled and probably gained aisles in the second half of the 12th century. Crundale in Kent, and Sheldon in Surrey. Crundale's north aisle is somewhat perplexing. You can sort of see it alluded to here behind the organ. It's only 2 bays long, and there's an absolutely massive pier in the middle, and its lean-to roof and correspondingly low ceiling render it incredibly dim. In fact, I don't have a good photograph of it because it's so dim. But even from the most advantageous spot, it's unlikely that anyone in the space would have been able to see into the chancel from the aisle. Crundale was initially composed of 2 cells, with an early Norman date indicated by a surviving window high on the north nave wall, whose functionality was curtailed by the addition of the added aisle. And in the late Norman period, an aisle was added here on the north side. The foundation date for the church is unknown, but it was given to Christ Church Priory, Canterbury, around 1150, according to a confirmation by Archbishop Theobald of a gift from Eustache of Mural. It's consistent with the fabric of the church that at least the chancel and nave were standing by 1150 when the church was offered to the monks at Canterbury, but we can't be certain about whether its north aisle had yet been built at the time. The Crundale North Aisle is unusually narrow by the average standards of parish churches. It's, at least now, it's less than 2 meters wide, approximately a third of the width of the nave. And not only is it tiny, but its arcade was constructed by excavating the existing wall rather than knocking out a wall and adding new columns. This is, in some ways, the simplest way of adding an aisle to a church. You gain space, but parishioners were spared the endlessly boarded up church during construction, as the exterior aisle wall was probably constructed before anything was removed. The roof line was also not altered by this kind of procedure, so the single gable causes the ceiling in the aisle to be very low. Given the early date and the vagaries of the remaining documents, we can't know for sure whether the aisle was built under the ownership of Eustache of Mistral or the monks of Canterbury, or perhaps it was the initiative of the parishioners that sparked it. So its patronage is uncertain, and any judgment about whether or not finances played a role in the size and character of the aisle is somewhat difficult to assess. The church at Sheldon in Surrey has existed since at least the time of Domesday Book, but its aisles were added later. Like Crundale, the aisles are very slim. The south aisle is 1.99 meters, and the north is 1.94. Sheldon is very famous for this painting on the west wall, depicting heaven, hell, and a ladder in between, perhaps a precocious representation of purgatory. And the composition, that's a few details. The composition of the painting fits well within the space allotted. It hasn't been compromised by the addition of the south aisle, suggesting that it may post-date the addition of the aisle or have been added around the same time as the aisle. So like Crundale, the Sheldon roof gable in the central vessel is extended to cover the aisle. There's not an additional gable added. The narrow aisles exemplified at Crundale and Sheldon were typical of early examples. The exterior walls at these churches are lucky survivals that offer evidence of the early expansion of parish churches, And although these examples are both in the southeast, these examples need not be dismissed as purely regional characteristics. So here, all the way in Lancashire, there's a lancet window in the west wall of the south aisle at St. Michael on Wyre, and this evidence is the same sort of impulse that can be seen, all the way on the other side of the country. So here, although the exterior wall is lost, this blocked lancet and the seam that goes along with it sort of testifies to this early initial aisle expansion here. But unlike at Sheldon or Crundale, where the early skinny aisle was retained, either because future construction was deemed unnecessary or unaffordable, St. Michael on Wyre is evidence of the common parochial trajectory of widening these first aisles. St. John the Baptist in the Soak of Winchester exemplifies the same sort of thing. It's these additions made in the second half of the 13th century. So its aisles are actually expanded to be virtually the same width as the nave. So we've now seen the pattern of the building works happening in parish churches in the 12th and 13th centuries. But what is the function of these aisle additions? Hamilton Thompson, in his Ground Plan of English Parish Churches from 1911, writes that the usefulness of aisles is at once apparent. They afford greater space for the distribution of the congregation. The aisleless church may be inconveniently crowded from wall to wall, and on the other hand, where spaces are left between the nave and side walls, the congregation will mass itself in the nave, but the aisles will be left free until the nave is filled, and thus there will be free access through the side doorways for as long a time as possible. Aisles also offer a clear space for processions and allow them to turn inside the church to a certain point and without difficulty. In addition to this, aisles form a convenient situation for the smaller altars of the churches, and from a very early date were added with this view. But Thompson offers relatively little to substantiate his views other than the sort of modern logic of somebody writing in the early 20th century. So while I agree with his assertion that the central vessel of the nave would continue to be the most desirable location for parishioners to stand, I take some onus with the position that aisles, expensive and inconvenient to build, were primarily for overflow circulation. Previous scholars have largely dismissed the theory that aisles were built to accommodate processions due to lack of liturgical evidence. But Thompson's final point about subsidiary altars, presented sort of as an afterthought, I think is the most promising of his suggestions, which I will consider further today. So why did aisles become de rigueur in parish churches when they had not previously been? I'd say the most sensible suggestion so far has been made quite recently by John McNeill, writing that it is highly unlikely that there was a single overriding reason behind the introduction of aisles. Far from a simple desire for additional square footage, these changes are reflections of broader meaning. As parishioners gained agency over their naves, the function of the parish church changed to incorporate burial and baptism. Therefore, it's logical that changes in spatial configuration would occur alongside these shifts. Although population growth and the spreading out of the congregation has frequently been cited as an explanation for nave aisles, scholars writing in the past 20 years, including Carol Crago and Peter Draper, have provided substantial disagreement with this theory. And in particular, I think the issues of sight and Eucharist cast doubt over population-related concerns. The elevation of the host, which ensured congregants visual access to the Eucharist after the moment of transubstantiation, seems to have been in practice in Northwest Europe relatively early in the 12th century, although lay people generally took communion only once a year. Windows at certain Romanesque churches, like this under the crossing tower at Barton in Cumbria, may have been deliberately splayed in particular directions in order to light the altar at specific times, perhaps to highlight the Eucharist for viewers. And in the late 12th century and throughout the 13th century, there was a significant debate and discussion among clerics and scholars about the consecration of the Eucharist. They attempted to theorize the precise moment of transubstantiation and sought to highlight the moment for the congregation in a range of ways designed to arouse all the senses. Perhaps most central to this, though, was the gesture of elevation. Mary Rubin has identified the earliest text that explicitly refers to this gesture as a statute from the Synod of Paris, convened by Bishop Otto of Sully. The statute is concerned in particular with the precise moment when the host should be raised, and states, "It is ordained that, when they begin the canon of the Mass at Quae Pridi, holding the host, they should not immediately raise it too high so that it can be seen by the people. Rather, to keep it in front of their chests, and when they say, hoc est corpus meum, and then they raise it so it can be seen by all." In the post-interdict years, Archbishop of Canterbury Stephen Langton's statutes show concern for the conduct and appearance of Eucharistic ritual. As Aidan Kumler has noted, in contrast to the seemingly less influential statutes of the Fourth Lateran Council, Langton's statutes were repeated through the 13th century, showing the desired performance of the Eucharistic ritual and the laity's comportment during it were put in writing in the early 13th century and maintained throughout the period covered by this study. Yet it's problematic to assume that the laity of the rural parish church understood theology and Eucharistic vision in the same way that bishops and theologians did. With regard, in particular, to the comportment of the laity, Langton writes, "Let the laity be admonished. They should comport themselves reverently at the consecration of the Eucharist, and let them kneel, especially during that time, when after the elevation the sacred host is dispensed." Subsequent English statutes of the 1220s and 30s, including one from an unidentified diocese around 1225, specify that parishioners should venerate the moment of elevation by looking and bowing while on their knees and joining hands with their fellow congregants. Additional contemporary factors contributed to the interest in the mystery of the Eucharist and may have helped parishioners' desire to see it. And Canon 20 of the Fourth Lateran Council mandated that the Eucharist be stored under lock and key. So this greater restriction made moments of access for the laity more privileged. The moment of the elevation of the Eucharist was the climax of the Mass, and lay people were meant to see it. Though chancel screens would, in the later Middle Ages, significantly block visual access, few screens survive from the 13th century, and the ones that do tend to survive, as Carol Craig has observed, survive in quite high-status churches like former minsters, like Stanton Harcourt, or ones with monastic affiliation. Low, solid stone screens survive at places like Little Wenham and Ampney St. Mary, shown here. And alternately, there are some rare examples of tall stone screens, like at Westwell in Kent, and these two Herefordshire examples. But in either case, there's some visual access to the chancel, though the parishioner would need to stand close to the screen in order to get a good view in. It seems that in the 13th century, such screens symbolically, rather than visually, excluded the laity. In practice, the moment of witnessing the elevation of the Eucharist may have looked something like what is represented in an early 14th century illumination from an Anglo-Norman text meant to edify lay people about how to comport themselves at the Mass. And so in this opening, we find a priest at the altar, elevating the host to the cross, behind him a server holding a tall candle, reflecting the extensive recorded provisions for illumination during the elevation. A group of lay people, mostly men, but there is one woman in there, kneel in the chancel. The crossing, where a bell is being rung to mark the moment of transubstantiation, carries across the gutter, and on the other side of the crossing, the rest of the congregation kneels, the huddled crowd all facing the altar. As Jackie Young has elucidated, the screen, not visible in this image, but implied by it, functions not as previous scholars had imagined to separate and exclude lay people from the Mass, but rather as a spatial divider that fulfilled a wide variety of incorporative functions. While the screens in English parish churches of the 13th century didn't necessarily contain substantial iconographic programs for the appreciation and edification of the laity, they acted as framing devices which concentrated their gazes eastward, prompting desire to permeate the screen and enter the chancel both visually and literally. Schematic as it is, this represents, at least in theory, what was meant to be going on at the central moment of the Mass. For this purpose, aisles are wholly unsuitable to witness that crucial moment of elevation. Viewshed analysis of the north aisle of the parish church at Orcop here in Herefordshire exemplifies this problem. The aisle was added in the early 13th century and never expanded, so it gives an impression of the width of early aisle additions. From the exterior, we can observe that the roofline is shared by the central vessel of the nave and the aisle, making the aisle itself low and dark. Were the parochial nave truly crowded, the majority of parishioners would not have been able to watch the elevation of the host. And were the parish responding to population increases, they would have likely built to the west so that a direct view of the chancel would be possible. But westward expansion into the parish church is rare, and as Peter Draper points out, a major reason for this is the typical location of towers in English parish churches to the west of the nave. Paul Barneswell has recently suggested that the slim aisles at places like Crondale and Sheldon may have been built predominantly to satisfy a growing desire for images in the parish church. And he notes that dark, narrow aisles would have been sufficient for accommodating images because they were lit with candlelight, perhaps even increasing the spiritual quality of engaging with the image. The fact that early aisles are frequently located on the north side of the nave contributes to Barneswell's point, since the north side was darker and therefore building an aisle in an already dark place that would be lit by candles is somewhat logical. Images of the Virgin were generally placed on the north side of the parish church, and so this is another kind of contributing factor. The assertion that aisles were created to hold images is difficult to test due to the widespread destruction of images in the Reformation. And in all likelihood, this was one function, but not the only function of aisle additions, hearkening back to John McNeill's comment mentioned earlier. Aside from the main mass at the high altar, masses could also be quite small indeed, with only one priest and assistant present, and this would seem to be the main function of a mass at in the small aisle of a church like Crondale. And finally, intramural burial for the laity was not, or was rarely permitted before the 12th century. But due to increased pressure upon the church from clerics and the aristocracy between 1150 and 1300, the burial of secular elite citizens in parish churches exploded. So, as we know, very few parish churches have been excavated. They've largely remained in use since they were built. But the ones that have been, like Barton upon Humber, reflect just how prevalent intramural burial became. So the team that excavated at Barton excavated nearly 3,000 skeletons and estimate that there were 14,000 in total. And of the period covering roughly 1150 to 1300, we see a seeming total lack of burials in the central vessel of the nave. And these are primarily on the aisles of the church. So although future excavation would be very useful in clarifying the function of aisles, there does seem to be sufficient evidence to show that burial was an important part of the multiple functions of aisles. So I've shown the affinity for building nave aisles and the significance of them as a sort of locus for lay-centered piety, an effective site for the permanent demonstration of social status, with masses being said and burials taking place. The aisled church is the prototypical form of the 13th century parish, and the addition of aisles to existing churches was common. Few newly built churches were constructed without them. But in spite of this, not all churches gained aisles, and there's actually a significant corpus of unaisled parish churches that instead received mural niches on either side of the chancel arch, which I think needs to be considered in the category of building as well. So Francis Bligh Bond acknowledges these altar niches in rood screens and rood lofts of 1909, and to the extent that they've been considered at all, it's been primarily as part of the chancel arch or as part of the rood screen composition. But I argue that these architectural gestures deserve further consideration, as they were intended to imitate both the aesthetic and liturgical functions of aisles. These niches are significant because they housed altars, perhaps, but not necessarily related to a chantry. In churches where aisles were too difficult or too costly to construct, or space did not allow for them to be built. In the absence of aisles, these mural niches provided an alternative way for members of the gentry to fund masses in their honor and diminish their time in purgatory. These features, although primarily found in the southeast quadrant of England, do not seem to be limited to that area, and there are niches on either side of the chancel arch at the Church of Scotton in North Yorkshire, for example, where squints were added later to provide a view into the chancel. As usual, one needs to exercise caution when determining whether a feature is regional or simply the result of poverty that made late medieval building impossible. But even so, in areas like the Lincolnshire Fens, where many 12th and 13th century parish churches survive intact, there are no examples that I'm aware of mural niches like this. And that was perhaps due to the wealth in that period, due to the construction that facilitated building those large churches there. Sussex is particularly rich with these niches. So another example is at Clayton, painted somewhere between 1080 and 1120, with these rounded arches on either side of the chancel arch, excavated from the wall to form altar niches. These are characteristically difficult to date due to the simplicity of the forms. They have no moldings or decorative details to suggest that when they may have been constructed. The north niche cuts off the bottom of the painting above it, which suggests that the niche postdates the painting scheme, but by how long? Now lost transeptal chapels, evidenced by scars, which were built in the 11th or 12th century on the north and 13th century on the south, suggest that additional space at Clayton was desired. So it's possible to imagine that the small church had at least 5 altars at some point. Hoxton in Cambridgeshire has niches on either side of the chancel arch that were added probably in the early 13th century to the simple 2-cell church. The south niche houses a wall painting of Thomas Becket, which has been covered over in this photo, that was rediscovered in 1860 after having been bricked up to prevent destruction during the Reformation. David Park dates it to the first quarter of the 13th century, probably contemporary or near contemporary with the niche itself. The north niche retains an architectural canopy, but no painting. It's supposed that a lost saint, often associated with Becket, perhaps Edmund, may have been painted here, particularly because this church has a present dedication to Edmund. Also in Cambridgeshire is Duxford St. John, which has a niche only on the south side of the chancel. The north aisle that exists today was added later in the later Middle Ages. And at Duxford, the south niche actually, I think, performed the same function as that later north aisle did. A similar arrangement can be observed at Castle Rising in Norfolk, where the dogtooth molded niche on the south side of the chancel arch was partially effaced by the addition of Victorian transept on its right. Sadly, the transept addition also destroyed the piscina, presuming that one was provided for the mural altar. Perhaps most interestingly, though, it's the fact that the right side of the altar niche itself effaces the late Norman chancel arch, indicating that it was not an original feature of the building, but one contemporaneous with the early 13th century fervor for aisles. As the later South Chapel suggests, space was not a problem at Castle Rising, so perhaps the choice to add an altar niche was motivated instead by funds. Castle Rising has quite an elaborate Norman church with a formal west front, and it's roughly contemporaneous with much of the chancel, but bears little resemblance to the nave's architecture. And this is probably because the nave was relatively recent, and the nave altar was added to fulfill a new need. Perhaps it was added while the Masons were on site for the early English renovation of the Norman chancel. Similarly, Brooke in Kent has a pointed Gothic altar niche on the north side of the chancel arch, in stark contrast with the rest of the Romanesque building. Obviously, the presence of Richard Plant is the most exciting thing about this photo, though. These niches are not exclusive to English churches and are sometimes found, for example, in Scandinavian parish churches. So these two examples have niches on either side of the chancel arch. At Malov on the left, the southern, Spandat in Jutland has niches on either side of the chancel arch, with the north niche having painting in and around it. And the southern niche was pressed into service as a means to access the pulpit in a later period. And at Malov in Zealand, there are similar niches, and here the impost block of the chancel arch continues across the eastern wall of the nave, split only by the niches, which seem to be evidence that they were a later insertion. A wide-ranging study comparing English and Scandinavian parish churches, I think, would be highly beneficial because there are a lot of really exciting and interesting similarities. So as a rule, these kind of altar niches were not planned as a part of building, but added when the combination of liturgical need and fashion necessitated it. The remaining evidence of church fabric shows that altar niches were virtually never constructed in addition to aisles, but rather installed as a replacement for them when they were impractical, although sometimes aisles have been added, 100 years later. They've developed in direct response to the increasing number of masses being provided for the souls of the community in places where the construction of aisles was not feasible. Though the primary position for these niches is at the east end of the nave on either side of the chancel arch, they're sometimes also found in other spots as well. And these niches excavated from the wall formed altars in the transepts of the aisle church of Ripple and Worcestershire. The transept is likely to be the earliest surviving part of Ripple, but the nave followed shortly after. So these were not necessarily executed instead of nave niches, but potentially in addition to them. Niches for altars were sometimes present within a great church context, and probably the best known one of these is St. Faith's Chapel at Westminster Abbey, where there's a sizable niche on the eastern end of the chapel with a painted reredos composed of a single figure of St. Faith depicted as a young woman holding her instruments of torture, the grill, within a microarchitectural frame. On the north side of the niche, a Benedictine monk is painted looking up at Faith and sending a prayer in the form of a text scroll that extends over the void between his medallion and the saint. The painting may postdate the altar niche recess itself. The chapel, with its mixed function as vestry, sacristy, and treasure house, was likely completed by 1249 and takes its slightly awkward shape from its interference with the chapter house at the east of it. Clayton, where the niche was clearly added after the execution of the painting, in this case seems to have been integral to the space, but further research is needed to assess the utility of similar niches in great church contexts. But the fact that the St. Faith's Chapel example is from the middle of the 13th century or later, certainly later than most of the examples I've come across in parish churches, leads one to wonder whether this was an idea that was borrowed from the parish church and brought into the great church context. Many niches were probably lost in rebuilding schemes. In many places, small Romanesque chancel arches were replaced with loftier Gothic ones, and aisles were added at a later date as well. In Curdworth in Warwickshire and Slapton in Northamptonshire, however, we see a different approach that adapts the Romanesque chancel arch rather than replacing it. In both examples, we see large hagioscopes with 15th century tracery on either side of the narrow Romanesque arch. These enable a better view inside the chancel, especially if people draw close to them, satisfying a similar impulse to the squints carved post facto on the dado of the Stanton Harcourt rood screen. So I think this is an important reminder of a characteristic that seems to be typical of England's parish churches, that their communities felt empowered to alter buildings in sometimes substantial ways based on their needs over time. Moreover, the presence of mural niches validates the importance of marginal space for lay piety in English parish churches from the late 12th century, in spite of the tendency to imagine lay autonomy in the 13th century as a completely new development following the legislation that parishioners were responsible for the upkeep of the church's nave. So while we can't be certain, at least not yet, about who decided what and how, we can better interpret the motivations for the things we see as material evidence in this huge category of buildings. So I think this is a critical moment to renew Morris's statement about how the most insidious thing in the study of these buildings is the belief that everything that can be known or is worth knowing is already known. So thank you for your attention today.
Thank you, Meg. That was wonderful. Richard, can you tell me, so with the online, will you field the questions?
I will deal with the questions if people type them in, although they tend to be rather reluctant to.
Right.
I will also amplify to the waiting world the questions you have for Meg.
I can see Martin Hennig has his hand raised, so.
This is an absolutely fascinating lecture, and I've actually been puzzling over one particular church, which in fact I think that the association, at least people who went to the Romanesque conference, would have seen, because it was very close to the conference venue, which is St. Giles Church in Oxford, because the church in general is sort of Romanesque transitional on the whole. Yes. the north aisle is fascinating. At the east end of the north aisle, there are two very classy windows. And this was dating from the 13th century. Yeah. And this was the chapel of St. Michael and All Angels. But that aisle, unfortunately, we need to strip off the roof above it, which actually does have original timbering. But it appears to me as though the whole aisle was divided into chapels, so that it was, now it's all clear, but it's clear that that there were 3 or 4 chapels along there, perhaps more, totally taking it up, almost like little transepts. Yeah. But there, of course, it's serving a liturgical purpose, and also, I think one was spotted before, but there were 2 consecration crosses on the to the south of this chapel of St. Michael and All Angels. So you were entering it from the nave, I assume, and there still is a piscina there. It's quite clearly it is that, and I presume that this is the sort of thing that has often been swept away, perhaps particularly in urban churches. But it's fascinating, and where you see something that seems to be really special, like those windows. There's nothing like those windows elsewhere in what is actually quite a plain church otherwise. But it appears that there was wealth there. Well, Oxford was of course a rich city, so this was presumably paid for by a guild or something like that. And I wonder whether that is the sort of thing that one is perhaps expecting to see in other churches where there's, as it were, private enterprise, particularly very rich individuals or guilds that want to enlarge the church and have additional chapels for celebration.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And that sounds like an absolutely fascinating case, so I'll need to have a lot. So it's St. Giles, is it Cripplegate?
It's St. Giles. It's the most northerly church in Oxford. It would have had fields beyond. It's beyond the city wall, and it's at the top of St. Giles.
Okay. I'm definitely going to have a look at that. As far as guilds and things of that nature, it just feels quite early in this 13th century period to be thinking that way. But I also suppose that, these two, at Sleaford, these 2 merchants banding together, that's almost like, kind of making a little bit of a guild or moving in that direction. So I wonder if it was something like a guild, or perhaps, a more informal type of kind of community arrangement like at Sleaford. But yeah, thank you for alerting me to that example.
Just hold it. I wonder if, given that during this period a parish would have been expected to attend church on Sunday, there was no alternative, have you looked at modelling parish population sizes with the churches and the potential development of the aisle?
Yeah, I haven't done that myself, but there have been some historical geographers who have attempted to do that work. And I think it's more or less been, people who have read those studies have more or less debunked them. I think it's quite difficult to, be thinking about population in that way. In some ways, because figuring out the population of medieval England is a very difficult task. There's an article, I think it might be in Church Archaeology by John Wand, that looks at that idea, I think, in a part of Gloucestershire. And he, I think, kind of comes to the conclusion that although there is an expansion going on alongside what seems to be a period of population growth, he doesn't necessarily see those as being all that deeply correlated. But that has been one of the things that's been suggested over time for why these aisles get added. But it seems in a lot of places, and I won't pretend to be an expert on population, that the churches that they had were actually way oversized for the size of the community that they had. Particularly some of these, this big Fenland churches and things like that. I don't really think they actually had the population to support that. And I know I have some recollection of Sandy Heslop in the Norwich Parish Church Group saying that some of the parishes, they're talking about mainly parishes in the 14th and 15th centuries, that they actually had very small, parish numbers indeed for quite impressive churches. But yeah, thanks for the question.
I have a question from the web. Our new friend Agnesi Sartor asks, is it possible that the nave hosted events such as mystery plays and that the architecture of the church reflected this need for the community to gather as an audience?
Thanks for the question. Not mystery plays in the 13th century. Not so far as I'm aware, but it's an interesting question. I think one of the things that I've tried to look at elsewhere in my research is that the nave of a church is not only for liturgical functions and tends to be used for a lot of other things as well, and is very much a social space. Things as varied as people probably selling things, sometimes storing their goods in places they weren't really allowed to be storing their goods, and even people taking sanctuary in parish churches, sometimes for years on end. So I don't know of any particular cases with mystery plays, and I do wonder. I think I would be a little bit skeptical about the idea that was a reason for a major rebuilding campaign. But it's an interesting idea. So thanks for the question.
I had a question about, so you showed those very interesting images from Denmark of these similar kinds of churches with these presumably image niches at the end. And you made this point about a further study, perhaps looking at the relationship between English parish churches pre-1300 and Danish churches. And to what extent could you expand that to think about, I don't know, the modern nations of the United Kingdom? Because obviously you've been focusing mainly on English parish churches. I mean, are there relationships, say, between Welsh churches and English churches, or Irish churches and the, post-12th century English churches? I'm just trying to think about ways that they can be more joined up, or is it possible to join them up in any way?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, one that I fear I don't have a great answer for. Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, they are, I'm thinking particularly England and Scotland, quite jurisdictionally different, and I think they come, I don't know those buildings as well as I would like to, but it would be interesting to be thinking, can we think more in terms of a sort of insular perspective on these types of buildings. I know as far as the churches that I've been to in Wales, those to me tend to be a bit more similar to the English examples. And I showed a couple from Herefordshire, and when I was putting this together, I couldn't actually remember if they were in Wales or if they were in England. And those kind of border regions, I think, do tend to be a bit slippery. But yeah, I think it's an important question, and I something I'd like to think about a lot more. And one of the things that I've been kind of concerned about and trying to figure out ways to cope with in my research is that I think the English parish church has not been put very well into an international context in Scandinavia and the continent. But I think you make a really good point, Lloyd, that we actually haven't put it in that great of a British context either.
But I can see why that's so difficult, because, when you were setting out, you must have been confronted by this absolutely enormous number of churches, and then the sheer difficulty of actually being able to travel to half these places and actually look at them. So you've got this kind of quantitative problem, and then you've got this other problem of saying something qualitative about maybe a few specific examples,
Yeah.
and then expanding that outwards to include Denmark or Scotland or Wales or Ireland problematizes something that perhaps it's even hard to get your head around in the first place.
I think when I started my PhD, that didn't even seem like a possibility to think beyond the borders of what is today England. But as I move forward, I find some frustration with the scholarship that it doesn't think more broadly in terms of these boundaries. When people were traveling, there were relationships, and yeah, I mean that's something I would like to think a lot more deeply about. But I think that is something that probably requires a big collaborative, funded body-funded project that would require the multiple people to be working. Which, if anyone's interested, I would love to do that.
One thing I learned from the Rome conference is that we all need to pay more attention to Scandinavia. So, yes, I see nodding from those who were there. Another question from the YouTube. Louise Hampson asks, is there any evidence that these early mural niches, especially those in transept or sidewalls, were later repurposed as Easter sepulchres? Before you get to that question, there is a big mural niche at Hereford Cathedral in the transept as well, before you start claiming everything for parish churches, Meg Bernstein.
Oh, Richard, don't take the fun out of it. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of that. Repurposing as Easter sepulchres, not to my knowledge, but that certainly doesn't mean that's not the case. And really, for something to function as an Easter sepulchre, doesn't it really just have to be a space to put something? And that would be kind of ephemeral and difficult to know about and to remark upon. But yeah, it's an interesting question about how are these being reused? How are these being, are they kind of multifunctional spaces or multifunctional devices? And one kind of can imagine a situation where that would be the case. But then, there's also the question of if these are consecrated as altars, is that then problematic? So to be continued on that question, but thank you for it.
Thank you. Weren't men and women at one point divided in services? And might that be a reason for having a designated space?
It's a good question. I have heard some things about men and women being divided at certain points, but I don't think that I'm not aware that there would have ever been a time that men and women would be not in the same high mass sort of service. But please, if you know better than I'd love to hear about that. But I don't really think that these are altars that are being used concurrently with the main altar. I think these would be used at different parts, different times during the day, rather than, I don't really see it as the extra screen at a sporting event where you can see what's going on the field, But yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it possible to say whether throwing out an aisle to an aisleless church had any effect on its acoustics? It occurred to me, looking at your early slides, that the sort of shoebox shape of an aisleless church is of a kind traditionally associated with very well acoustic concert halls. The Wigmore Hall, not far from here, is a very good example. And I don't know what effect it would have had, but I would expect it to have some. And I mean, what I'm thinking about is what effect it might have had on sermons. I mean, you can see that throwing out an aisle might have allowed space for a larger congregation if there was a sermon, and there is a growing demand for the sermons from the 13th century onwards. I mean, and mendicant churches, are basically large halls. They have no aisles. They're big spaces so that people can both see and hear the speaker. But if you pack them into a aisleless church, is there the possibility that the sound might not be as good as it might be, to the disadvantage of the sermon, so that you have more people to hear it, but they can't hear it so well?
Yeah, that does present a perplexing problem, doesn't it? I suspect that it would, have an impact on the sonic quality to the extent that people were thinking that way. I simply don't know. I know that there are some, places where quite advanced methods are being used, risers and ceramic containers and things like that to help with sonic quality, mostly in kind of collegiate churches. But it's to be totally honest with you, it's something that I haven't considered, and I'm delighted to get the opportunity to now consider it. So thank you for bringing that up.
Is any form of quantification possible? I suspect not. But even taking into account later changes to see which churches are aisled and which weren't aisled, and whether any patterns emerged from looking at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a point in my life where I had some grand illusions that I might be able to do such a thing. I've since given up on all manner of things. Yeah, I mean, there are a couple problems with it. One, there's the sheer number problem, which is a difficult problem. But the other is, of course, that so much fabric has been altered over time. So even if we are able to, kind of categorize what is now extant, we probably are missing out on some churches that don't survive at all, as well as quite a lot of fabric that doesn't survive at all. I think the closest we could probably do to what you're saying is, sort of a smaller regional study. So I attempted at our Cambridge conference, and the publication is now out, to try to look at, can I, for a small area, look at those numbers and try to work out how many churches did get aisles, how many churches didn't get aisles. And I think Larry Hoey did something somewhat similar for Kent. It might be a different county now. It might be Nottinghamshire, something like that. So there have been a couple of attempts like that, and I think those can be useful, but because of this problem of survival, they kind of need to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt. What I determined from the Cambridgeshire ones that I was able to work out is that something like 66% of them gained aisles during this period that I'm interested in. But I think I would struggle to be much more confident than that because of the different issues. Not so much. I mean, it was more or less regular. I mean, the only thing is that I looked at Cambridgeshire, and in particular, I mean, there are relatively few parish churches in the Isle of Ely, so that was part of why I was able to do Cambridgeshire, because it meant that there was a kind of compressed number because of the geography. But I can't say, I mean, it basically is, in the 12th and probably more to the point 13th century, there's quite a lot of churches that get aisles. But I don't really feel like there was much more of a pattern that emerged from it than that. But I'm not also a mathematician, and would like to be, though. But thank you for the question.
I was going to ask, if I'm allowed, yes, about status in these niches, because Brooke, for example, and the one you showed before it, getting old, my memory's going, are both, I mean, it was Castle Headingham, wasn't it?
Rising.
Castle Rising, yeah. Castle Rising. I mean, Castle Rising looks quite collegiate in many of its forms, and Brooke obviously belongs to the Priors of Canterbury. Do you think that this is a sort of, the institution is keeping command of the whole space, giving the parish a couple of niches, rather than letting the parish expand off to the sides type of process?
Yeah, I think that deserves some further consideration. Maybe. I mean, I think I've thought of it more. I mean, this one is a problem, isn't it? Because because they were able to then add a later transept. There is space. It's not actually a space issue, and it's quite a fancy situation. So it probably isn't a money issue. So I would say that what you're proposing, Richard, seems like a very sensible thing that deserves further consideration.
There's a first time for everything.
If there aren't any more questions, I think we should probably wrap up. But if you could all join me again in congratulating Meg on a really great lecture. Thank you. And just to say that our next lecture will be Costanza Beltrami on the 6th of May, talking about Gothic networks in 15th century Spain. And I think we're going to try and have a reception. It will be the president's reception, actually, afterwards, which will be the first time we've had any kind of party in a long time. The BA, that is. I'm sure you've all had lots of parties in the last 2 years. I have absolutely no idea.
I think the idea is to launch Cambridgeshire and maybe a Romanesque volume as well.
You're the editor, though, of the Romanesque volume? No? Okay. Well, thank you very much. 4th of May.